So thank you for coming to the last Climate People Environment Programs seminar of the fall semester. It's my pleasure to invite and have listened to Professor Gavin McNicol, who's a collaborator of mine who I met several years back when we both kind of intersected on this FluxNet methane study and in other circles related to wetlands and methane and questions around that. And Gavin has been my go-to for understanding how we take all this messy data and put it together in a way that makes sense. And so we'll hear a little bit about that today. Just for introduction, he got his undergraduate degree at the University of Stirling in the United Kingdom in environmental sciences. And then came over to the States at the University of California, Berkeley, where he worked with Wendy Silver on his PhD in ecosystem science, and it was focused on wetland greenhouse gases. So he's been staying in that area for a bit, and after completing his most recent postdoc at Stanford, which is where I had an opportunity to get to know him, he joined the faculty of the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2021. And he just told me he finished his last final of the semester, so I think he's ready and relaxed to just talk to us about fun stuff as we all come and take over his town next week for those of us attending the American Geophysical Union meeting, where there'll be a number of additional talks on peatlands and wetlands and methane, I believe, including probably some from your own lab. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and feel free to throw in questions in the chat or elsewhere. Make sure you're muted while we're on, and we'll save some time for open Q&A at the end as well. All right, over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Anchor. I'll just make my screen full screen. Yeah, so I've been here in Chicago for about 2 years now, and my group is called the Wetland Climate Interactions Across Scales group. My talk today is going to focus on my involvement with FluxNet methane, this global synthesis activity, but I'm also really interested in building local research in the Chicagoland region on the greenhouse gas balance of native Chicagoland ecosystems and those across the Midwest. So very interested in talking about those topics as well with folks, and we'd be happy to follow up with a meeting or a talk maybe at AGU. So as I said, my talk today is more at a network and global scale. So thinking about data-driven modeling to upscale emissions of methane from sites to the globe. So maybe to set the scene, I wanted to talk a little bit about where we are today in terms of global methane cycling and climate mitigation through reduced methane emissions. So this is a figure that I've shown over the last year a couple of times, and it brings us from
Hey, Gavin, sorry to interrupt. I still see your intro slide and not in full screen, so I don't know if we're sharing the wrong monitor.
I'm sure, yeah, I think I'm sharing up. Sorry about that.
There we go. Yep, that's
okay,
good.
Sorry about that.
No
yeah, so this slide is one I've shown a few times in the last year. It's showing the annual growth rate in methane concentration in the atmosphere since records began in 1983 and bringing us up to 2021. And so you can see the growth rate was high in the 80s and 90s. Then we reached a plateau in the 2000s, this slowing down of the increase. And then there's been this phase of renewed growth from 2007 to 2014. And what we're now calling accelerated growth since 2014 onwards. And actually just this, 2 years ago now, we recorded the highest ever annual increase. So that was greater than 15 parts per billion increase in a single year. But today I actually was revising these slides a little bit and went onto the NOAA website, and they've just updated this figure. And the news is a little disappointing. So according to the NOAA data set as of this year, the year 2021-2022 actually showed an even higher rate of increase. So we're up to 18 an 18 parts per billion increase in a single year, which is really extraordinary given the record that we have. So it's a concerning trend that is a concerning trend to begin with, and one that is now accelerating in the wrong direction. And so this is, as I said, concerning, but there's also this opportunity with methane mitigation in particular to delay the most extreme temperature scenarios associated with climate change. So this analysis was conducted by Sam Abernethy, who was a student of Rob Jackson's at Stanford, the group that I was a part of for my last postdoc. And he did this nice analysis where he considered a range of different emission scenarios, including some methane mitigation scenarios, and their effects on temperature over the next 100 years, or up until 2100. And so this black line here is showing that this regional rivalry, a high emissions scenario, which is looking maybe more and more like the trajectory that we're on. So this is a situation where geopolitical rivalry undermines the efficacy of international emissions reductions. And so that's this black line. And then the gray line is the low methane emissions scenario, again, drawn from the IPCC, where we have a 40% reduction in methane emissions by 2050. But because there's this growing appreciation of the importance of these point source super emitters of methane, and at least from the fossil side of things, a better understanding of those emission sources, Sam was interested in looking at even more aggressive emissions reductions for methane. So he generated these scenarios of 1.5 times and two times greater emissions reductions than this low methane scenario, and actually implementing those back as early as 2030. So you can see that the anticipated temperature change over the coming century is much less under these aggressive methane emission scenarios. And the main take home from this study was that we can effectively gain about 60 years before we cross a 3-degree warming threshold relative to this regional rivalry scenario. So it's an interesting case for global methane because we have a very concerning trajectory of accelerating growth with this pretty bleak recent couple of years. But then we also have this potential for effective relatively short-term decadal mitigation with aggressive methane reductions. So maybe pivoting a little bit to think about how we got here to this situation of accelerating methane. This is really a story about new methane sources and really our inability to properly attribute those sources to specific sectors of the methane budget. So this is the most recent global methane budget, which is put together by the Global Carbon Project. And you can see there's sort of two broad classifications of sources in the budget. So there's anthropogenic sources in orange here, and natural sources and sinks in green. I guess there's a couple of things I want to address here. First of all, there's two flavors of modeling approaches to generating these emissions totals. So there's bottom-up models. So these are process models with explicit parameterization of methane temperature sensitivities and rates of emission. That ensembles of these models are put together as part of a bottom-up view on methane. And then there's a top-down view, which is using satellite observations and surface flask observations of methane concentrations to infer sources globally using inversion systems. And so the numbers are quite different. We can trust the total emissions more from the top-down view because they're using actual observations in the atmosphere. But it's really concerning that our process understanding clearly isn't enough to accurately model and reduce this discrepancy globally. And then, of course, there are differences in these estimates for the individual sources too. So we have an under-constrained methane budget, which makes it difficult, broadly speaking, to attribute the rise in methane to particular sources. So a couple of broad statements we can make, though, is that the post-industrial increase in methane is really driven by the new sources. So those are the anthropogenic sources, fossil fuel production, extraction, and these new agricultural sources, so ruminant and rice agriculture and waste. But it's probably not those same sources that are driving the current dynamics in the atmosphere. So here we have in blue the mole fraction for methane over the last 30 years or so, and you're seeing that phase of stabilization and then renewed and accelerating growth. Well, we can look at the isotope signature of the atmospheric methane pool to get some more information about the general patterns of sources of methane. So during the stabilization period, we saw pretty stable isotope signals. But since the onset of the renewed growth and accelerating growth phases, we've seen a depletion in the C13 content of atmospheric methane that is broadly more in greater agreement with biogenic sources of methane, which have a lighter isotope signal. This is one clue that it's really biogenic sources of methane that are driving the renewed growth. Something slightly more definitive is an analysis by Yumi Oh at NOAA. This paper came out this year. And so she used a variety of emission scenarios and isotope composition scenarios to force a forward run of a global circulation system. And so she used some different scenarios that included either uniform isotope signatures for global wetland methane emissions or new products that they developed of the isotopic content of emitted methane. And a final scenario that included an increase in microbial emissions, so natural emissions, plus a large increase, a 40% increase from fossil emissions. And that's really the difference that I want to draw your attention to here, is that methane concentrations were reproduced in all 4 simulations, right? So you see this continued increase, but only in the scenarios without the large fossil contribution was the isotope signal reproduced. So this scenario D, where there was a large fossil increase, did not reproduce the isotopic signal in the atmosphere. So this is not quite definitive proof, but it is strong evidence that it's really not the fossil increases that are driving the majority of this new accelerated growth in methane. So that helps us zoom in a little bit on the biogenic sources, which is getting a little bit closer to the main focus of my talk. So the biogenic sources are, as I mentioned, agriculture and waste, the anthropogenic sources, but also this large wetland emission and of increasing uncertainty are these natural emissions. You'll notice that the uncertainties around wetlands are quite large, if you can infer from both the difference between the top-down and bottom-up model estimates and the uncertainty range within those types of modeling flavors. And you'll notice that for open water bodies, there's this really large difference between the top-down and bottom-up estimates. And this is really to do with uncertainties around open water body emissions, which in this most recent budget, open water emissions of methane showed a really big increase due to some changes in the way that open water and wetlands were attributed. So we're able to zoom in on these biogenic sources a little bit as sort of a main place of concern. So what are these systems? So primarily we're thinking about rice agriculture, both kind of waste as in landfill systems, but also wastewater, which is about 2 to 6% of the global methane budget. The wetlands are probably the larger uncertainty of these different groups, and then ruminant agriculture are relatively easier to quantify given inventories of cattle and so on by country. So I'm going to switch over real quick to a quick animation. So I wanted to just show this animation because although there's a large amount of uncertainty in the attribution of emissions from top-down models, the top-down models are using real observations of atmospheric methane, right? And so it is a strong constraint on the total amount of methane in the atmosphere. And the challenge is really being able to attribute that emissions to particular regions and sectors in these hotspots. So I wanted to show this animation because I think it's a cool visualization, but it's also, and it shows us kind of our best data set for understanding the total amount of methane in the atmosphere. It's also led us to be able to sort of largely dismiss or kind of set aside one of the main hypotheses for how wetlands may be contributing to the accelerating growth. So you may have heard of the kind of runaway methane hypothesis, and this is an idea that with the rapid warming happening at high latitudes, there's going to be a lot of permafrost thaw, changes in the hydrology at regional scales, and mobilization of carbon that could be released as methane over the coming decades. But these satellite and inversion-based estimates of methane emissions haven't really observed the increase that we would expect if this was a major, if this runaway methane was occurring. And so there's been some recent work, again by UMIO actually at NOAA, that's being able to sort of set this aside to some extent. And so it's we may be thinking about wetlands as being a part of this accelerating growth, but probably not Arctic wetlands yet, at least. So in her study, she looked at she estimated methane emissions from 3 different process models that do or don't include this type of soil methanotrophy called type 2 methanotrophy. So that's where soil microbes can actually consume atmospheric concentrations of methane. And so she found that the models that were predicting this runaway methane in the Arctic were not incorporating the type 2 methanotrophy, but when this process was included, the emissions estimates came in much closer agreement with the top-down inversions that aren't seeing this kind of rapid acceleration in Arctic methane. So in terms of, again, zooming into our area of interest, we can sort of set aside this hypothesis for now, though it might be more important later in the century. So, we've talked a little bit about the problem and what we're understanding and what we don't understand about the problem. So what can we actually do to help kind of resolve and better constrain the global methane budget? And one kind of broad theme that that really results in a lot of analyses, much more than just the analysis I'll show today, is to start to constrain the global methane budget with surface flux observations. And that's this FluxNet methane activity that I got to work on with Anchor. So maybe just coming back again to this global budget, when we look at the uncertainties around wetland emissions, for example, or these open water emissions, it's important to remember that neither the top-down nor the bottom-up model ensembles are really taking advantage of networks of surface flux measurements. So the top-down models do use atmospheric observations, but they're currently not making use of surface fluxes. They're really just using the mole fraction information observed in the atmosphere. And then bottom-up models are sometimes calibrated to one site or a few sites, for example, to parameterize a temperature sensitivity, but it's difficult, and to date it hasn't really been done to calibrate to kind of the network information from a whole range of sites. So this, again, has not really utilized network data. And so the community that I got to join and be a part of is really the FluxNet community, which most of you may be aware of this, but it's sort of the largest global community of eddy covariance scientists. So eddy covariance is a technique, a micrometeorological technique that measures the vertical motion of the air above an ecosystem at very high frequency to build a statistical picture of the exchange from the soil and plant canopy into the atmosphere. And you can look at different scalars. And so most of these sites that are highlighted on this map are just primarily measuring CO2 and water vapor. So these are the really longer running sites. But over the last decade or so, the instruments required to make these same measurements for methane have become available. So these tall, white domed instruments are the Lycor 7700, which is, I think, the most commonly used open path sensor. And these sensors don't need a lot of power, so they can be deployed in pretty remote locations and run off the grid. So that's one of the reasons why there's been this big proliferation in methane measurements, largely in wetlands, but also in rice paddies, as you can see here. And I was also part of the AmeriFlux Year of Methane, which was very successful in bringing in a lot more data and helping PIs establish new methane sites. So all of the sites here in yellow were registered after 2017. So the AmeriFlux Year of Methane effectively doubled the site number in the Americas over just a couple of years. So there's this potential for this network to be reaching a level of maturity that can start to inform or provide insights at regional to global scales. So this is the FluxNet Methane Community Products. It was led by or published in a ESSD by Carol Delwish, and it has 81 sites, methane flux sites, and about over 200 site years of fluxes. And you can see there's quite a range of sites, including several, all of the major wetland classes: bogs, drained wetlands, fens, marshes, and so on, but also several upland sites. So these are often crops or forests, some lakes, and some mangroves. So it's a rich data set that's available for community use at fluxnet.org. And in addition to the methane fluxes, these being eddy covariance sites, there's also a rich amount of ancillary information or additional flux data that can, as I will talk about later, be used to both understand and interpret methane fluxes, but also model methane emissions. So this is an example from a site in Germany of, I think, six site years here of methane fluxes. And you can see there's some really clear patterns with seasonality and temperature, maybe even some associations too with increases in primary production, so increases in carbon supply for the methanogens. But maybe zooming in again to think about specifically wetlands, even if we rule out the high latitudes and this, for now, this runaway methane scenario, there's a vast diversity, incredible diversity of wetlands globally. Even though the data set does include some of the major wetland classes, we're sort of humbled by the fact that there's a tremendous variety of wetlands that we haven't really captured yet in this data set. But for example, some of the major classes include fens here, swamps, so forested wetlands, emergent marshes. This one's in California. And these would be kind of wet tundra environments on the top right. And then, of course, even riparian wetlands. But then there's these maybe slightly more ambiguous systems for classification. So although lakes are not considered as wetlands in the global methane budget, around the periphery of lakes, you might have emergent marshes or fens. There's cryptic wetlands that we can't see, but maybe a high water table under a forested canopy would still support methane production. And then, of course, there's coastal wetlands. There's vernal pools, which are small but can be large methane sources, and then systems like delta mudflats and estuaries. So a really wide diversity of systems that I want to acknowledge that this data set is just starting to build appropriately rich information on these systems. But there are a couple of key insights that we were able to glean from in this initial analysis of the data set. So if we think about annual emissions from these sites, we see there's a predominantly right skewed data set. So these are the sites in our data set are primarily sources of methane. And the larger sources are primarily marshes and fens. And then we sort of see lower emissions for bogs, drain systems, and wet tundra, and of course uplands as well, which are sometimes also sinks. And so we are seeing that there is a sort of class effect of on wetland emissions generally. But if we look at maybe more of a continuous scale, we can see one of the main results was that there is a clear temperature dependency of methane emissions at an annual time step across a variety of different wetland classes. But important to note here is that the strength of this regression was much, much greater when we just looked at temperate, boreal, and Arctic climates. So one of these kind of main take-homes is that outside of the tropics, there's a strong temperature dependency that explains here both the annual methane flux, but also seasonality within a given year. So that was just kind of a quick vignette of the data set itself and some of the broad patterns that we were seeing. My contribution to this project was to start to build global terrestrial emissions product for methane emissions for wetlands in particular. And I'm cheating a bit here by showing this global product for CO2 fluxes, but this is maybe one of the potential kind of end goals of this type of an analysis, right? So this is a 3D sphere showing net ecosystem exchange. So you have depressions and green colors where you have net uptake by ecosystems, net CO2 uptake. And then you have enhancements in these concave regions of CO2 emissions from ecosystems. And this is a figure that's developed, or an analysis that's led by the FluxCom group at the Max Planck Institute. But it's something I think that we can use as a kind of aspirational goal for this type of global analysis for methane. So upscaling is the methodology that we use to generate these types of regional to global products. And very briefly, it involves the use of a statistical model or process model to transfer information across scales. So we might observe some pattern, say methane emissions at the land surface, and be interested in how that is regulated by a process, right? And we want to build a model that can predict the spatial and temporal distribution of some pattern, and explain some pattern using some process understanding. In the case of most upscaling studies to date, this has been done by using a machine learning. So in this case, you collect a large amount of potential explanatory data based on the processes you think are important to explain the pattern. So this might be point data, raster information on climate, and so on, polygon and soil data. And then you want to use that as an input to develop some kind of model to link the explanatory variables with methane flux. And then you have to then force that model at the global scale to produce the gridded products that you're most interested in. So in our study, the first step was to train a machine learning based upscaling model. And so we selected data at just the freshwater wetland sites. So there's 43 sites in the data set. And we grouped them into site clusters to use in what we call a leave one out cross-validation scheme. And so when we're training the model, we trained a random forest algorithm. And when we train the model, we train the model on all of the observations except for one of these clusters, which we hold out. And then we evaluate the predictions at that held out cluster. And we rotate the held out cluster around all of these different 26 clusters to build to evaluate the model performance on all of the available data. So this was done on 119 site years of data. While we're doing this cross-validation, we're also identifying the best predictors that minimize the error on these held out cluster predictions. So we started with a potential set of candidate predictors that were over 200 candidate predictors. So those were things like MODIS products of vegetation greenness, soil properties, so things like from products like soil grids. They were sometimes meteorological data that were measured at the tower. So a wide variety of different geospatial and tower measured variables. And we used a feature selection process called forward feature selection, which is recommended for spatial prediction tasks, where we start adding one or two predictors out of this large number of candidate predictors and see which predictor results in the smallest error in the model. And then we sequentially add in a stepwise fashion additional predictors until we reach some error minimum in the model. And so in this case, we actually reached a global minimum after 11 predictors, but we had very marginal gains after the 6th predictor. So we actually only retained these first 6 predictors in our model. And one thing I just want to highlight here is that these predictors are really reflect a temperature dominated dependency in the model structure. So if we look at the variable importance rankings in the model, air temperature was the most important by quite a large measure. And then we have actually air temperature again with a lag coming in 4th. This predictor here is a static climatological temperature normal. So it's another temperature dependency. This is precipitation, canopy height, and then EVI is a measure of vegetation greenness. So this is another dynamic one. But I wanted to just emphasize that, make the connection between the fact that our model is really a temperature dependent model, more or less. And we observed this important temperature dependency outside of the tropics in our analysis of all of the FluxNet methane sites. So perhaps not too surprising that we're getting this temperature dependency in the final model. And then just quickly to talk a bit about evaluating the model, we found that the model performs quite well at the global scale, and especially in the extratropical regions. So on this panel on the left, we have predicted fluxes versus observed fluxes, and these are the site mean fluxes for each site. So we see that there's a really big spread in fluxes across the different wetland classes. And there's a few outliers that the model really didn't do a good job of predicting. That in this case, this Old Women's Creek wetland is in a pretty eutrophic site on the lakeshore of Lake Erie. And we actually excluded that site for subsequent analyses in evaluating the model, because we deemed that to be an outlier in the data set. But yeah, overall, we got R-squareds that were comparable to other upscaling studies. This metric here, NMAE, is normalized mean absolute error. So that's values less than 1 mean that our error is smaller than the variability observed at a site. So we're in many cases less than half. The errors are less than half the size of the variability of the site. So I think that's quite an encouraging value and low overall bias. But the main take home here is that when we look at the individual site performance, when we include the temporal dynamics of the model, you can see that in these 3 sites, we do a pretty good job of reproducing the fluxes. So the model predictions are the gray bars and uncertainty, and then the observations and their uncertainties are these points. And so you can see that this is actually I believe one of Ankur's sites, Aliquash. And then this is a site in northern Minnesota at the Marcel Experimental Forest. So these are sites where we'd expect to see a strong temperature dependent seasonality in emissions, and it is reproduced in the model. sort of consistent with this idea that we are generating a temperature dependent model. But this last figure on the bottom right is a test site that we evaluated in Peru. And it's actually a humid tropical forest site, but it does emit methane. And we find here that, we don't really reproduce any seasonality in the predictions. So you can see there's quite a distinct seasonal cycle in this site. But if you think about the climate of a humid tropical forest, the temperatures aren't really changing dramatically throughout the year. And so it sort of raises this question about what other forcing effects are driving seasonality in these humid tropical and other tropical regions. And that's sort of a clue as to what we need to improve going forward. So once we have a model that can reproduce the flux measurements fairly realistically, we have to decide what type of a wetland product we want to scale the emissions by and mask the global particle with. So we use this WAD2M dynamic wetland and inundation product, and that's developed by Zhen Zhang at I think University of Maryland. And so this is actually the backdrop. The blue colors in the background of this map are showing the wetland fraction from, I think, August, so the maximum extent throughout the year from this product. And we chose this one both because it's a dynamic product that incorporates satellite information on inundation, but also because it's the product that's used in the Global Carbon Project's methane budget activity. So by using this product, we can directly compare our flux estimates with those coming out of the methane budget, and the wetland uncertainties are not contributing to any differences. It's just the fluxes. But I did want to really emphasize that although my talk really focuses on understanding the fluxes, the wetland area uncertainties are a huge part of this problem, this challenge. And so we did also mask our product with the GEMS2 wetland extent, which is another new global product and another dynamic one. And you can see here that the differences in the wetland area between these products is pretty substantial. So in purple, we have the WAD2M dynamics. We see sort of an annual seasonal fluctuation between about 3 and 5 million square kilometers of wetland, with some interannual dynamics too. For GEMS, we see a much lower minimum and almost comparable maximum, but so a really large seasonal oscillation. But just, I wanted to show this really big difference between these wetland products and the clear implication that has for understanding and quantifying the global methane emissions from wetlands. So in terms of our WAD2M based upscaling products, we were able to generate some overall time series average fluxes. So you can see really where the hotspots of emissions are in our product, the standard wetland complexes in the high latitudes, and also some of the humid tropical basins in the Congo, the Amazon, and Southeast Asia. One area that's much less certain, and it's sort of picked out in our uncertainty map below, is these monsoon and semi-arid region emissions. So we have places like the Bengal Basin, the Sahel, these large floodplains draining south in South America, and then parts of northern and western Australia. And so we have larger uncertainties there, as well as large flux predictions. And so that's something I'll come back to in a minute. Very brief illustration of the difference that those wetland products have on the total emissions. You can see here, when we look at the annual sums of emissions, or the monthly sums of emissions in teragrams, the GEMS product at the bottom here is really much lower emissions than our WAD2M product. So that's kind of humbling, but the encouraging side is that our WAD2M upscaling does overlap pretty well with the GCP top-down and bottom-up ensembles that are shown here in green and orange. So we're sort of encouraged that the global emissions totals, when we use the same wetland product, are coming out fairly similar. And to break that down a little bit, this is the way that the Global Carbon Project kind of decomposes this global source is into these latitudinal bins, so tropical emissions, northern latitudes, Arctic, and then temperate and then Arctic emissions. So these are the kind of standard bins, which is a fairly coarse analysis, and I'll come back to that again. But we can see that, as I mentioned, we get quite good overlap with the bottom-up process model ensembles, and less good agreement with the top-down emissions. But I think this is sort of encouraging that at a global scale, we are not getting wildly different emissions totals. And then in the high latitudes and northern regions, we get fairly close agreement. Where we start to diverge more is in the tropics. So you can see we have large uncertainties in the tropics. We also have the lowest emissions from any method. And when we decompose that into different regions, things start to get a little bit weird. So our Amazon predictions are much lower. Our Amazon, Congo, and Indonesian predictions, so these are these humid tropical basins, are much lower than either top-down or bottom-up models. And as you might have guessed from that previous map, our monsoon and semi-arid regions emissions are higher than expected, or higher than we expected from the GCP. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about, it's encouraging that we are getting these sort of plausible emissions totals, but clearly we have a lot more to do to understand the tropics and reduce uncertainties there. So, what more can we do and what have we been working on? Well, the first thing I wanted to just really visualize is I think it's important that we don't sort of copy and paste or attempt to copy and paste our understanding of the classes and function of wetlands from high latitudes and temperate systems into the tropics. There's some really pretty extraordinary regional scale wetland complexes in the tropics that we have a very limited understanding of. So one example is the Okavango Delta, which is this vast inland delta that the interannual dynamics of flooding in this system are different or differ year to year. And it's also just distinctive in that this is an inland delta ecosystem. And then you can contrast that with a delta system in somewhere like this is from Sarawak and Borneo, where you can quite immediately see there's this vast difference in land cover, difference in humidity and moisture, general availability. And so the fact that we have such, we have a pretty naive ability to extrapolate to these regions currently, because the wetlands are different to those in the temperate regions, and we have so little data on those that are there in the tropics. So I wanted to just quickly, kind of end on a couple of analysis directions that we're using to better understand the representativeness of our data sets in the tropics, and kind of try to diagnose problems in our models, potential problems in the GCP models, and inform where we should try to get new data. So this figure on the top left is a global map of the Köppen-Geiger climate zones, and we thought this would be an interesting way to kind of define regions of similar climate that would be potentially meaningful for wetland methane. And so we overlaid on this the current FluxNet methane sites, and then also the potential new sites that we can acquire through the channels that we already have established. There may be more data out there, but especially including chamber data, but I haven't visualized that on this map. And it's useful for diagnosing our model because you can start to look at where the large emissions in the tropics are coming from. And again, we see that the pattern in the tropics for us is inverted relative to the GCP. So this darker orange is really the arid tropics or arid regions. And while there might be a contribution from some of these regions where there's seasonal wetlands, it seems unlikely that it would be quite this high. Similarly, the humid tropics are less than this, and this is kind of an inversion of what we see in the GCP model, where they have much higher humid emissions. And so I think we can sort of diagnose this. It's really likely due to the lack of data from these regions. So we have essentially no observations of methane on these kind of monsoon, semi-arid boundaries where we might get seasonal wetland cover. And then we only have a couple of humid tropical forest emission towers, measurement towers. And those are just happen to be sites where the emissions are much lower than we would expect. And again, I think this kind of is a combination of not having enough information about the types of wetlands in the tropics to begin with, to really understand whether we're capturing those conditions, and the fact that we're extrapolating from a few sites to a large region. So I think there's this great potential to improve our emissions estimates in the tropics by adding some of these sites, and also bringing in chamber data. And maybe just wanted to show you one more visualization. These are figures that my student Otto has put together. He'll be presenting at the Hyperwall next week at AGU, some of this analysis. And this really helps us pick out where we're seeing the methane contributions in these different climate regions. So you can see that the standard enhancements that we always see for the West Siberian lowlands, these high latitude regions and Hudson Bay lowlands. And we see enhancements, as you might expect, for Southeast Asia, the Congo Basin and Amazon Basin, but there's these kind of curious enhancements around these boundaries here. And, you know, given that we know our model is really strongly temperature sensitive, this is the regions where you have some of the highest temperatures and the potential for some seasonal inundation. But the question of, there's a real question there of whether these are real. And I think we need to think about how to validate these predictions. Maybe just one last piece of evidence that there might be some, these might be plausible sources of a methane is to look at satellite data of, from in this case, the Tropomi satellite, which gives us almost global coverage of methane enhancements in the atmospheric column. And you can see there's actually quite a strong methane enhancement both in the winter and the summer, Northern Hemisphere winter and summer, in this kind of semi-arid band just south of the Sahel, and then extending north during their wet season. And so this is something that I think, my analysis really was working in this purely data-driven environment, working just with this upscaling model. But I think starting to bring in analyses that compare the regional contributions from top-down models, bottom-up models, and the upscaling information can start maybe help us triangulate where the likely sources of methane are in these different regions. I have a couple of slides on mitigation and kind of policy considerations, but I do want to leave time for questions. So maybe I'll just let you ask if there's any interest in thinking about, what's the implication of these high emissions of methane in terms of policy actions. I can address that then. So that's in terms of rice, wetlands, and the waste sector. But maybe in summary, global methane is showing this accelerating growth, which is really disconcerting. But methane mitigation done aggressively and soon could buy us some time. Currently, our real challenge is attributing the sources of methane, attributing emissions of methane to particular sources. So we might see a regional enhancement, but we don't know if it's wetlands or rice. And so from a wetlands perspective, we really need to reduce the uncertainties so that we can better attribute sources to potential anthropogenic sources. And then those are the sources that are actually best for mitigation actions. So reductions in rice and waste emissions would be promising. Okay, so I'm going to finish there. Thanks very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Gavin. Lots of intriguing results from your scaling. Open it up to any questions from the audience. You can either unmute or chat.
I have a question.
Go
Can
for
you
it.
hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Gavin.
Yes.
Great talk. One question I have is a lot of times I will see papers that look at like aquatic chemistry, and I'm wondering, I think when you look at water table depth it's easy to control that in a wetland to try and reduce methane emissions, but it's harder when people are talking about the connections with like salinity or like different factors that have to do with aquatic chemistry, like how might we improve or reduce methane emissions from wetlands by changing the water chemistry? Like, is there some like powder that could be applied, or does it have to be like you have to control like upstream nutrients or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, right? And I think I think one sort of geoengineering style approach that's being proposed has been to basically add oxidized forms, like electron acceptors, to wetlands at scale. There's, if it's sulfate, for instance, that you added, you might be able to inhibit methane production. And if you had some way to recycle the sulfate, recycle the sulfur back into an oxidized form, you could maybe maintain a mitigation effect. But there is, weird, some maybe unexpected chemistry associated with that, with acidification of the soils once you drain it, and so on. And also just doing that at scale seems like quite a maybe far-reaching manipulation of these natural environments. For rice, as you say, water table manipulation is actually demonstrated as a really promising approach to mitigate methane. Whether we could do that in wetlands, I think, is, again, at scale is a different question. And of course, you risk mobilizing a lot of carbon that could be respired as CO2 if you do that at scale for peatlands. But I guess, my other side that I skipped over was really thinking about the overall relative balance of wetlands, and what's the policy prescription for wetlands, even if we find out that it is wetlands that are driving a large part of the methane budget, and maybe even contributing a lot to the accelerating growth. And I think, in the last couple of years, there's been some nice analyses by Scott Neubauer showing really that we have to think about the lifespan of a wetland system and the cumulative radiative forcing effects of the wetland over that time. So, the conclusion that he comes to in his analyses is that these wetlands that have been around for several thousand years in the tropics, for example, are the carbon accumulation in the soils has a much stronger cooling effect than the kind of decadal methane emissions effect. And, basically over the course of 1,000 or 2,000 years, you'd expect this initial warming effect by methane to be offset by the cooling effect. And I was just showing on the right here a few examples of these tropical peatlands where these systems are very old and almost certainly having this cooling effect. So in terms of the management of the wetlands, I do think at smaller scales there is the potential to manipulate the water table in a way. But I think I haven't really been convinced by the examples of like introducing sulfate or redox manipulations. But I think it's good to remember that these ecosystems are often functioning as long-term sinks for greenhouse gases. Sorry, that was quite a long answer.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Thoughts, questions?
I guess I have a question if others don't. I know that this sort of inundated area sort of wetland mapping debate gets pretty huge. Like what is your thought about like what's kind of the best map or the best way going forward to really get real-time sort of estimates of what could be releasing methane and where?
Yeah, I think it's not the area of this analysis that I've spent the most time working on. It's not really my background as much as the fluxes are. But I think the WOD2M product is really promising because it fuses a satellite observed surface inundation with these static inventories of different classes of peatlands and fens, these static inventories. And the problem with WELD 2M is, I guess there's two. One is that surface inundation dynamics are hard to see if they're below a canopy. So there's still that problem of, confidence in the in these tropical basins in the Amazon, for example. The other thing that we noticed in our study is that you saw that there were these flux enhancements over or high fluxes over some of these semi-arid regions. And one thing that Jen notes in his paper is that some of those arid regions have very high albedo, and that can sometimes lead to some errors in some artificial wetland prescriptions there. So I think one of our thoughts with some of our downstream analyses is to basically exclude this darker orange zone from our global totals, because we might expect some wetlands here in these seasonally wet places, but the Sahara, the really very arid regions, not so much.
Yeah, the Sud and Sudan is like this huge, crazy like wetland area in the Nile that is I mean, don't exclude that, but I can totally see how the reflectivity of a lot of the desert areas cause there's some computer glitches when it comes to figuring out what's wet and what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's something we have to kind of experiment a little bit with carefully. And but the GEMS 2 product comparison, it was remarkable how much less wetland area that was predicted by that model. But frankly, there's a really large number of steps that goes into the fine tuning of these models, and it's sort of I think would take a detailed analysis of its own to really pull that apart. But I do think that the satellite information is a good start in terms of defining seasonal dynamics of inundation, because as I showed for the Botswana Okavango Delta, that's a seasonal delta that's dependent on kind of some sort of teleconnection with precip far away. So those hydrological dynamics are going to be important to capture.
Yeah, there's a question on chat from Susan. Says, thanks for the talk. Does FluxNet have any measurement areas near fossil fuel sources, such as natural gas lines?
I know that there are some urban towers now that are measuring, in urban ecosystems, methane emissions, and those may pick up a signal from fossil sources with gas infrastructure and so on. And there's like a lot of street level measurements in certain cities where people have driven around with a flux measurement system or a concentration measurement system to pick up hotspots that are sometimes associated with gas wells. For the actual flux measurements, my understanding that like the major point sources of fossil emissions, say wells that are leaking, I think that those have mostly been identified using remote sensing. So looking at plumes, trying to detect plumes from those locations using satellites or aircraft-based measurements. I don't know that FluxNet so far has really focused on fossil emissions, and even anthropogenic emissions outside of rice. There's very few kind of pasture systems. There's a couple. I don't know of any. I don't think there's any like landfill emission flux towers, for instance, in the data set. So the other anthropogenic sources, I think, are pretty promising.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because there are these new urban setups going on in Europeans with the ICO cities study and the Department of Energy urban integrated labs studies. But most of that's still pretty emerging, and it's pretty difficult to put a flux tower near a known gas leak because it's a point source, and flux towers kind of assume that things are homogeneous. So you have to use other techniques to essentially be able to detect and identify the source. So that's my understanding. I was just to wrap a final thought, and then we'll let you go. So you mentioned how much of an outlier a site like Old Woman Creek is. That site has also vexed us as well in the CO2 side of things. It's as Jess can tell you. But I'm kind of curious, like, can we learn something from those outliers? Because the outliers are interesting, right? If part of this is we're trying to understand, is there this enhanced source of wetland methane emissions, then I'm a little concerned, right? If the model can't explain those outliers, well, how common are those outliers? And can we use the difference between those two to learn something about where we might find other sources like that? Or is it really just one site and it's just off by a factor of 10? And we should give Gil Borer a hard time.
Yeah, I think it's sort of running up against the limits of purely data-driven analyses where if there's not a critical mass of observations under a certain condition, let's say it is because there's eutrophic conditions or something, and if we don't have a critical mass of those observations, we won't, the model either won't be able to attribute it, or it will sort of choose to treat it as an outlier. And because I think, and then I think when we're extrapolating the model, in a way we do want to, we want the model to be generalizable. So we don't really want to propagate these really exceptional conditions unless we can attribute them appropriately. So yeah, I think it sort of, it's another way that we've run up against the limitations of our current data set, where we might only have 1 or 2 examples of sites for a given combination of conditions. But then also, I think that's where maybe fusing a kind of process knowledge with, process modeling with some data-driven constraints on parameters, for example, could be beneficial, because if you can attribute at Old Women's Creek the high fluxes to a process, say high nutrient loading, then we can sort of make the upscaling model incorporate that, even if it's not a large amount of data. But yeah, it's something that for this analysis we decided to exclude it because the model structure wasn't reproducing the fluxes anyway, and so it wouldn't extrapolate even if we'd included it in the training.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, let's call it time. Thank you for listening all, and definitely if you missed the beginning, there's some of it that will be recorded and down the road. And of course, as Gavin mentioned, if you're coming to the AGU meeting, come see his students talk, or poster, if you mentioned you all, and other talks about wetland methanes. Thanks again, Gavin.
Thanks very much.